Hello and welcome to The Mirror. My name is Rick Novy and this is episode number 7. My special guest today is David Lee Summers, who is editor of Tales of the Talisman magazine as well as an author in his own right. And this is the third of 4 interviews that I collected at WesterCon 2009. Hope you enjoy it. And we're coming from Tempe, Arizona at the site of the 2009 WesterCon. My special guest today is David Lee Summers. David is a professional astronomer. He edits Tales of the Talisman magazine and is also a writer in his own right. Welcome, David. Thank you for appearing on the show.
Thanks for having me, Rick.
So tell us about the professional astronomy. You're the first professional astronomer I've had on the show yet.
Well, I work in scientific support at Kitt Peak National Observatory, basically supporting operations at the Kitt Peak 4-meter telescope and the WIN 3.5-meter telescope. WIN is an acronym. It's a consortium of universities, Wisconsin, Indiana, Yale, and then the N is for NOAO, so that means everyone can apply for time on that telescope. And so I basically am there. I'm the guy who's there at night trying to make sure that people who've proposed for time get the best science they can out of these telescopes.
And how long have you been at Kitt Peak?
Well, I've been back there about 1.5 years at this point. I've been there for a total of 5 years. I had been there about 15 years ago, left to go do things at New Mexico State University, basically be the guy who does the lab demos in the physics department there, and then I ended up getting a call about a year, like I say, about 1.5 years ago, asking if I'd like the job back. The kids were a bit older, seemed like a good time to go back into sort of the night schedule, and the schedule allows me a lot of time off to write, so that's one of the reasons why it was attractive to go back.
Now, you've got a little bit of a hellish commute to get there, though, don't you?
Yeah, I have about a 5-hour drive from home to Kitt Peak, but I'm actually not the longest distance person in our group. We have one person who commutes in from San Diego every other week. So
but that's not a daily commute, though.
No, it's not a daily commute. I just drive over stay for 6 nights, and then drive home. So.
And what's your favorite part of doing that kind of work?
Well, my favorite part about the work is just kind of being on the front line of astronomy. I get to hear about all the really cool discoveries kind of right as they're happening. Just a couple of weeks ago over at the WIN telescope, they were doing the first infrared observations of dark matter galaxies. Basically, this was a galaxy that was discovered because there's only maybe a handful of stars in it, of luminous stars, but you know it's a galaxy worth of material because you can study the orbits, you can get the spectra of the way these stars are moving, and you know there's a heck of a lot of matter there that you can't see. And so just, this is something that's churning right now in the back of my mind as to what story this is going to become, but it's, you get to kind of see that, and it gets to influence your writing.
And you're also editor of Tales of the Talisman, which I believe was called Hadrosaur Tales originally.
It was originally.
And how did you get involved with editing, and what sort of what caused the change from Hadrosaur Tales to Tales of the Talisman?
Well, I think because it was really to take it way back to the beginning. The company that I co-own is called Hadrosaur Productions. And this was founded when my wife was working on her MBA at the University of Arizona. And this was back when I was first at Kitt Peak, actually. And the whole idea of the company was actually it was going to be a company producing serialized audiobooks. And that was that was where it came from. And Hadrosaur sounds had just been discovered. Hadrosaurs were big around Tucson. That's where the company name came from. And the whole idea behind Hadrosaur Tales when it started was it was going to be essentially an anthology that would feature the authors who might have serialized books through the company. Well, as it turns out, we only ended up producing one serialized book, and this was back in the days of cassette, back in the days of pretty primitive, by today's standards, 4-track tape decks. We didn't have the audio sophistication to really do this well. Tapes were expensive to sell. So that part kind of didn't go anywhere, but then Hadrosaur Tales gradually was going through this change of just people submitting to it, and it grew into a magazine of its own right. And then after we'd been doing it for about 10 years, we realized, what we had was not really an anthology series, but really a magazine. So we had decided that we needed to take Hadrosaur Tales into more production values. And about that time, about two things happened. Is I met the folks who took over the publication of my novels, The Pirates of Sufiro, Children of the Old Stars. That was LBF Books. And basically we struck a deal where we could co-opt and get a little bit of break on our printing costs. At about that same time, I met Laura Givens up in Denver, who is a very talented artist. She's ended up, I introduced her to LBF Books, and they ended up hiring her as one of their artists. And as we started talking, she ended up moving into the art director position for Tales of the Talisman. And that was, I really needed someone who could sort of manage the artwork end if I was going to have illustrations. And that was one of the things we decided would be the difference between what Hadrosaur Tales was, which was just basically stories in a pretty vanilla anthology format, to the magazine, which is fully illustrated with nice illustrations at the beginning of each story and good covers. Laura Givens came in with the idea of having the really good illustration. She had a good community of artists who could provide interiors as well as covers and back covers, and I think we really have come up with a good professional-looking product.
Great. I know I've been pleased with the 3 or 4 times that I've appeared in the magazine, and David Boop, who was on last time, has also appeared in the magazine, and I'm assuming he's been pleased with it as well. It is a very nice-looking magazine.
The stories you and David have had in the magazine have been very well received.
Well, that's good to know. Mm-hmm. Thank you. So let's change track a little bit and talk about your long fiction. You are a novelist. You've written several novels, and I think the latest is called The Solar Sea.
It is, and this is a copy of it. And this was my most recent book. I actually wrote this as a challenge from my publisher. It was for the National Novel Writing Month a couple of years ago.
Oh, the November NaNoWriMo.
The November NaNoWriMo. And actually the story goes back to, it's actually the very first idea I ever had for a novel. I had it way back in high school. Decided I wanted to write this story about the first people who go out and explore the outer planets aboard a solar sail. And I started writing it, and of course it was probably about what you would expect for a high school kid trying to write a science fiction novel. It was derivative of just absolutely everything, and somewhere along the line this probably very thankfully got lost. Soon after I sold what ended up being my first published novel, The Pirates of Sufiro, about 10 years ago, I tried writing it again. And I got maybe 20,000 words into the book. And again, I still had bits and pieces of it.
Yeah.
But
for people that don't think in words, that's about, 100 pages?
Maybe 100 pages or so. And then finally, when Jackie Druga Johnston, who was then the owner of LBF Books, challenged me to this, I said, darn it, I'm going to actually write this book.
And how long is that?
And this ended up being about a 60,000-word novel. So it's a short novel, and it's really meant to be an all-ages kind of book. It's not really a young adult book in the sense of the protagonist being a kid, but it's maybe a young adult book in the same sense of Heinlein's early adventures. And really that was kind of what I set out this time, and that's what really focused me, was I said, I really want to do the kind of book that excited me like the Heinlein books did as a kid, but I know modern kids aren't going to grab onto the idea of Nazis on the moon, which Heinlein was writing. So I wanted to kind of bring it up with modern problems and a modern problem that they have to solve. And essentially what happens is the protagonist discovers these particles that look like a great new energy source that are up by Titan, and that's how he eventually gets the funding to build the solar sail to go out to Saturn and find for these particles.
Of course, it takes a professional scientist to think about the funding before you can get the ship. Most writers will just assume that the funding is there and the ship is built and they go.
And that ends up being, so that ends up being the initial problem, and then being. I bring to it the fun and adventure I hope I've seen, sitting here at the telescopes, trying to convey what it would be like to actually visit Mars and to visit Jupiter and Saturn. And one of the things I got to have fun with was going and visiting Olympus Mons, the biggest mountain in the solar system. And what a lot of people, I've seen Olympus Mons in a few different science fiction novels and in a few submissions to Tales of the Talisman. And what almost everyone gets wrong about Olympus Mons is yes, it's a very tall mountain, but it's also a very broad mountain. The thing's about as big as Texas. So when you're sitting on the top, you don't necessarily see off the mountain like you would see off Mount Everest or something. So that was one thing I got to play with in this, was what it was like to actually walk around and look at this caldera that's so big you can't see the other side.
You've got a few more books in that stack there. Can you talk a little bit about what other work you've done?
Well, I've kind of worked in several different genres, and the other genre I'm probably have done the most in, other than science fiction, is sort of horror and vampire paranormal type work, and this ended up actually being the third novel I'd published, which is Vampires of the Scarlet Order, and oddly enough, that also had a genesis in my life in astronomy. A friend of mine, Janie Lee Simner, came over and did a panel for us over at the Border Book Festival in Las Cruces. And one night we were just sitting around shooting the breeze, and she suggested, I live in Las Cruces, New Mexico, the city of the crosses. And she just sort of popped up with, what would a vampire make of the city of the crosses? And she said, I don't write vampire stories. She used to be in a writer's group with Laurel K. Hamilton and such. But she said, gee, if you have if a story ever comes to mind, feel free to run with it. And so about 2 weeks later, suddenly the story of, what if a vampire supported telescopes, got the job supporting telescopes at an observatory, and what if he ended up moving to Las Cruces, and what does he think of the crosses and all of that. And that became the short story Vampire in the City of Crosses, which ultimately got into an anthology called New Voices in Horror, which was shortlisted for the Stoker, in fact, and then became a chapter in Vampires of the Scarlet Order. And I ended up, that ends up being about the midpoint of the book, as it turned out. I ended up starting out back in the days of the Spanish Inquisition with this set of vampires, and they end up being mostly a set of mercenaries, and it tracks their adventures through the modern day. And then I also have another vampire book here, and this is just kind of a fun little collection that came out from Sam's Dot Publishing called Blood Sampler. And it's a collection of mostly flash fiction that was done by Lee Clark Zumpa and myself. And most of these were published in a little tiny magazine called Blood Samples. And the key was most of these had to be 150-word short stories or less. And a lot of what's kind of fun about this book is if you discover Vampires of the Scarlet Order and like it, a lot of these are the little Genesis ideas. These were essentially almost my writer's notebook that became this book, and some of it actually is going into the new one that I'm working on right now, which is called Dragon's Fall. And so it's kind of a little insight into thoughts, and it's really beautifully illustrated by Carolyn O'Neill. And then I also, in addition to editing Tales of the Talisman, I also edit, I've done one anthology so far for Flying Pen Press, Space Pirates, and it's got 15 short stories, excellent short stories, and all exploring themes of piracy in space, and ranging from sort of the campy to just really serious explorations of what it would be like to try to make a living as a space pirate.
Well, one last question, and I'm going to change it up a little bit from what the first 5 interviews that I did on the podcast were talked about how there's been talk in the speculative fiction community about the irrelevance of science fiction. I think we've heard enough of directly addressing that. So I think I'm going to ask you just where you see the genre going in the next decade or two.
It's a good question, and I think a lot of it is, I think science fiction writers need to do their best to kind of keep on top of where science is going. I think science is going in some really exciting directions, and a lot of them are not necessarily people in spaceships going out into other worlds. Some of it is medical technology, some of it's nanotechnology. Some of what our objectives in space might be changing. And I think that's going to be reflected in some ways in science fiction. And I think there was an idea presented at the panel you were moderating last night that I think is a really good, is a really interesting thought, and I kind of think I see hints of this, and that is electronic publishing taking on a much more important role in science fiction. And it's just that science changes so fast that one of the things that can happen with science fiction is you can get your story out in a webzine or something like that while a topic is still really topical and in the news, where if you send it to a print magazine, it might be a year or more before it comes out in a magazine, and someone might read that and go, so what? It's been disproven, or I forgot that was even a topical item or something like that. So I kind of see electronic publishing taking on a stronger role in science fiction publishing, and just sort of generally see people trying to keep on top of science more.
Okay, well, thank you very much. It was a pleasure talking to you, and good seeing you again.
Good seeing you.
Okay. Well, that was David Lee Summers, a friend of mine and a really nice guy. That brings us to our news segment. Philadelphia, believe it or not, Philadelphia will be having on Wednesday, October 7th, a funeral and various other proceedings for Edgar Allan Poe, who died, sometime in the mid-19th century. The festivities, if you can call them that, will begin with a viewing on October 7th. Ew. The casket will be closed for the funeral, which is on the 10th. I think that's probably a wise choice. World Fantasy Lifetime Achievement Awards have been awarded to editor Ellen Asher and author Jane Yolen. Congratulations to both of you. My book, believe it or not, is finally here. Winter, Sam's Dot Publishing. You can get it at Genre Mall. $6. Good for the soul. And finally, a bit of sad news. And this is a little bit late because of the delay in getting episode number 7 out. Charles N. Brown, who was a very major figure in speculative fiction, probably unknown to most readers, but certainly writers and editors were. He was well known, and most of us were very fond of him. He passed away recently. He was one of the founders of Locus magazine, and he kept it running for many, many years. Charles, we miss you, man. That's all we have time for today. We'll see you next time, in which I will have the first time I've ever interviewed 2 people at once, and I'll leave it as a surprise for next time as to who those 2 are. Until then, we'll see you. Bye.